The massive space station floated in the darkness between stars like a jewel made of metal and light. Unity Station was the heart of galactic power, where 47 different species gathered to make decisions that affected billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. The council chamber inside was enormous, with seats arranged in circular rows that rose toward a domed ceiling showing the stars beyond. Each seat held a representative from a different civilization, and today, they were all focused on one topic that made the air feel heavy with tension. Ambassador Councl stood at the center, speaking platform with his reptilian features, set in what looked like confidence. He was from the Vaxan Empire, which had ruled over 12 star systems for 3,000 years, and his voice carried the weight of that ancient power. Behind him, on the large display screens, were images of human ships and colonies, spreading across space like seeds scattered by wind. He gestured toward the images with one clawed hand, and his words echoed through the chamber with force and certainty that made many representatives lean forward in their seats. The humans were new to the galactic community, having only discovered faster than light travel 70 years ago. In that short time, they had claimed 12 star systems and built colonies on 32 worlds. Their ships moved with purpose through space, and their technology improved at a rate that made the older civilizations uncomfortable. Councl spoke about this expansion as if it were a disease that needed to be stopped before it spread too far. He called humanity dangerous and unpredictable, and said their rapid growth threatened the careful balance of power that had kept the galaxy mostly peaceful for 5,000 years. Jake Morrison sat in the observation section reserved for non-voting attendees. He was a commander in the Earth Defense Fleet and had been sent to represent humanity's interests. Even though humans had no vote in council matters yet, his uniform was simple compared to the elaborate clothing worn by many other species, but he wore it with quiet pride. Next to him sat Sophie Blake, who served as the diplomatic liaison between Earth and the Council. She had spent 2 years learning the complex protocols of galactic politics and had warned Earth's government that trouble was coming. Sophie leaned close to Jake and whispered, in a voice so low that only he could hear. The translator device in her ear allowed her to understand the dozens of languages being spoken, but right now she spoke plain English. She told Jake that Councl had been building support for this vote for 6 months and had promised various species trade benefits and territorial concessions in exchange for their support. Jake's jaw tightened as he listened, but he kept his expression neutral because showing emotion here could be seen as weakness. The debate continued for hours, with species after species standing to voice their opinions. Some supported Councl's position, saying that humanity's military buildup and aggressive expansion could not be ignored. Others argued for more time to study the situation or suggested diplomatic solutions. A few spoke in humanity's defense, pointing out that humans had never attacked another species and had followed all the rules for colonization. But the voices calling for action seemed louder and more numerous than those urging caution. Then something changed in the chamber. An old figure rose slowly from a seat in the highest row where the most ancient species sat. Elder Vorn was from the Keeper race, which had been watching the galaxy since, for most current civilizations had learned to make fire. His species rarely spoke in council sessions, preferring to observe and record rather than interfere. When he stood, the entire chamber fell silent, because everyone knew that keepers only spoke when they had something important to say. Vor's voice was soft, but it carried clearly through the chamber without need for amplification. He spoke in the old galactic tongue that only scholars still learned, but the translators gave his words to everyone present. He said he must warn the Council against taking military action against humanity. His species had studied Earth's history going back thousands of years and had watched how humans behaved in war and peace. What they found was a pattern that repeated across every continent and every century of human existence. Humans did not forget wrongs done to them. When attacked, they did not simply defend their territory and then return to peace. They remembered every injury and every loss. They carried grudges across generations and would pursue enemies to the ends of their world if necessary. Vorn said his people had recorded over 300 major human conflicts, and in 70 Percent of them, the humans had continued fighting long after their opponents wanted to surrender. They did not stop when they won. They stopped when they were satisfied that justice had been served according to their own measure. The chamber erupted in noise as dozens of species began talking at once. Some laughed at the warning, saying one species could not stand against the combined might of the Galactic Council. Others dismissed it as fear-mongering meant to protect humanity's interests. Krell's voice rose above the others, saying that the Keepers had grown soft and timid in their old age. He said that humans were no different from any other species and would bow to superior force, just like everyone else had throughout history. Sophie gripped the armrest of her seat hard enough that her knuckles turned white. She had studied Earth's history too, and she knew what Vorn was talking about. She had read about wars that lasted decades and feuds that passed from parent to child for generations. She had learned about enemies hunted across oceans and revenge taken after years of patient waiting. Jake saw her expression and gave a small nod because he understood too. They both knew what the Council was about to unleash if they voted for war. Vorn tried again to make his point. He said that attacking humanity would not end with a simple battle or even a short war. It would begin something that might not end for generations because humans would not stop coming. They would rebuild after every defeat and learn from every loss. They would track down everyone involved in attacking them and would not rest until every debt was paid in full. His words were heavy with the weight of 1,000 years of observation, but they fell on ears that did not want to hear. The vote was called, and the chamber's voting system lit up with colors representing each species' choice: green for yes, red for no, yellow for abstaining. The lights flickered across the chamber like stars being born and dying. When the count finished, 32 species had voted green, supporting military action against human colonies. 12 voted yellow, choosing to remain neutral. Only 3 voted red, and one of those was the Keepers themselves. Krell raised his arms in victory. Many in the chamber cheered or made sounds of approval in their own languages. Jake and Sophie sat in silence, watching as the galaxy's most powerful civilizations made the choice that would define the next decade. Elder Vorn gathered his robes and walked slowly toward the exit. As he passed the observation section where the humans sat, he paused for just a moment. His ancient eyes met Jake's, and there was sadness in them. He spoke quietly in English, which surprised both humans because Keepers rarely used other species' languages. He told them he was sorry. He said he had given his warning and done what he could. He hoped that mercy would be granted when the time came, but he feared it would not. Then he continued walking, leaving the chamber, while behind him, the Council began planning their attack. Jake and Sophie sat together in the observation section as the meeting continued around them. Neither spoke for a long time because there was nothing to say. That would change what was coming. Sophie finally broke the silence. She said they needed to warn Earth immediately. Jake nodded and stood up. They left the chamber together, walking through corridors filled with aliens celebrating their vote. No one paid attention to the two humans, leaving because they were just observers from a minor species that would soon learn its place in the galactic order. But Jake and Sophie knew something the celebrating aliens did not. They knew that humanity was about to show the galaxy what happened when you attacked someone who never forgot and never forgave. 3 weeks passed after the Council vote, and humanity received no warning before the attack began. New Plymouth was a farming colony in the Epsilon sector where 3 million people had built homes and raised families under a yellow sun that reminded them of Earth. The planet had rolling fields of grain and orchards of fruit trees that had been carefully adapted to grow in alien soil. Children went to school and people worked their farms, and nobody expected that morning to be their last. The combined fleet arrived at the edge of the system and immediately began moving toward the planet. 6 species had contributed ships to the attack force, with the Vaxan Empire leading the operation. They had 40 warships, including heavy cruisers and carriers filled with ground troops. The fleet commander had orders to secure the colony quickly and establish it as a forward base for further operations against human space. Krell himself watched from his flagship as the fleet approached New Plymouth. Captain Ben Hayes commanded the frigate, Defiance, which was on patrol in the outer system when sensors picked up the incoming fleet. His ship was small compared to the cruisers approaching, but it was fast and well armed for its size. Next to the Defiance was another human frigate called the Guardian. 2 ships against 40. Ben stared at the Councl display showing the enemy fleet and felt ice form in his stomach. He opened a channel to the Guardian, and both captains understood immediately that they could not win this fight. The attack began with orbital bombardment. The alien warships positioned themselves above New Plymouth's major cities and opened fire with plasma weapons that burned hotter than the sun. The defensive shields protecting the cities lasted less than 10 minutes before collapsing under the sustained assault. Buildings melted and streets turned to glass under the intense heat. The capital city of Riverside held 400,000 people, and it died in the first hour of the attack. Ben watched from the edge of the system as the planet's surface lit up with explosions. His tactical officer was Lieutenant Amy Chen, who had family living in one of the smaller settlements. She stood at her station with tears running down her face, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She asked Ben if they were going to attack, and her voice shook with barely controlled rage. Every instinct Ben had screamed at him to charge in and fight, but his orders from Earth Defense Command were clear in situations like this. He told Amy to set course for the jump gate at maximum speed. If they engaged the enemy fleet, they would die and nobody would know what happened here. Their duty was to survive and report. Amy's hands tightened on her console, and for a moment Ben thought she might refuse the order. Then she nodded and entered the commands. The Defiance and Guardian turned away from New Plymouth and ran for the system's edge where they could jump to, faster than light speed, the enemy fleet. Notice the 2 human ships trying to escape, and 3 cruisers broke formation to pursue them. Ben pushed his ship's engines beyond safe limits until alarms blared throughout the bridge. The cruisers were gaining, but slowly. The jump gate appeared ahead like a ring of salvation floating in the darkness. Behind them, New Plymouth continued to burn, and the communication channels carried the screams of people. Dying in the cities below, the Defiance reached the jump gate 8 seconds before the first enemy cruiser came within weapons range. Ben gave the order, and his ship leaped across space, back toward Earth. The Guardian followed close behind. As they jumped, Amy turned to look at the display one last time, and her expression would haunt Ben for years afterward. She had just watched her sister and 2 nephews die, and there was nothing any of them could have done to stop it. The journey back to Earth took 6 hours through a series of jump gates. During that time, Ben ordered his crew to compile every piece of sensor data and every communication they had recorded from New Plymouth. The ship's computer assembled it into a comprehensive file that showed the attack from beginning to end. The colonists had broadcast desperate messages, asking for help, and wondering why this was happening. Some of the final transmissions were from parents saying goodbye to their children. Ben arrived at and transmitted his report directly to military headquarters in Geneva. Within an hour, he was summoned to appear before the Earth Assembly. He had never been to the seat of human government before, and the building's marble halls. It felt cold and empty despite being filled with people. He was escorted to the main chamber where representatives from every nation and colony gathered to make decisions for all of humanity. Secretary General Patricia Cole stood at the front of the chamber wearing a dark suit that matched her expression. She ordered the lights dimmed and the report from New Plymouth played on screens that covered the walls. The assembly watched in complete silence as cities burned and people died. The footage showed children running from buildings that collapsed behind them. It showed hospitals hit by orbital strikes. It showed farmers in their fields looking up at the sky as fire rained down on them. When the video ended, nobody spoke for almost a minute. Patricia Cole stood with her hands gripped together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She asked Ben to describe what he had witnessed, and he reported everything in a clear military tone that did not reflect the horror he felt inside. He told them about the 3 cruisers that had chased his ship. He told them about the communications that went silent one by one. He told them that New Plymouth no longer existed. Admiral Richard Stone stood up from his seat among the military advisors. He was the highest-ranking officer in Earth's defense forces and had served in uniform for 43 years. He asked Secretary Cole for authorization to respond to the attack with full military force. The chamber remained quiet as everyone waited for her answer. Patricia looked at the screens that still showed frozen images of New Plymouth burning. She said the authorization was granted. She told Admiral Stone to show the galaxy what happened when you murdered human children. She said to make them understand that humanity did not start this war, but humanity would finish it. Her voice was cold and controlled, but everyone in that chamber could hear the fury underneath the words. The Assembly voted unanimously to support full military action against every species that had participated in the attack. Across Earth, the machinery of war came to life. Shipyards that had been building cargo vessels and passenger ships switched to warship production. Factories that made farming equipment retooled to manufacture weapons. Military bases that had operated with skeleton crews filled up with volunteers faster than they could be processed. The veterans who had retired from service returned and put their uniforms back on. Every human colony received the same message from Earth. The message said that New Plymouth had fallen, but would be avenged. It said that Earth was mobilizing for war, and every human was now part of the war effort. It said that the enemy had made a terrible mistake and would learn what it meant to attack humanity. The response from the colonies was immediate. Ships began moving toward assembly points. Resources were diverted to military production. Young people enlisted by the millions because everyone had seen the footage from New Plymouth. Captain Laura Pierce received her orders while commanding a carrier that was being refitted at Mars orbit. The ship was called Vengeance and had been scheduled for 6 more months of upgrades before returning to service. The refit was completed in 3 weeks, with crews working around the clock. Laura was given command of a task force that included the Vengeance and 14 other ships. Her orders came directly from Admiral Stone. She was to take her task force into enemy territory and find the fleet that had attacked New Plymouth. When she found them, she was to destroy them completely. Admiral Stone's final words to her over the communication channel were simple and direct. He asked her how far she should take this mission. Laura looked at the image of New Plymouth on her screen and asked what he meant. Stone told her to take it to the end, and then he ended the transmission. Laura called her senior officers together in the carrier's briefing room. Her intelligence officer was Commander Ryan Foster, who had already been tracking enemy fleet movements for the past 2 weeks. He had identified the most likely locations where the attack force would have returned after hitting New Plymouth. The other officers listened as Ryan outlined his findings and suggested targets for their first strike. Laura studied the data and made her decision. They would hit the enemy where it hurt most. They would find the ships that had killed 3 million civilians, and they would make sure those ships never threatened another human colony. Her officers nodded and returned to their stations to prepare. The Vengeance and its task force left Mars orbit. 6 hours later, heading for the jump gate that would take them deep into enemy space. Behind them, Earth continued to prepare for a war that would reshape the galaxy. 6 months passed while humanity prepared and the galaxy watched with nervous attention. The human military grew from a defensive force into something designed for long-range offensive operations. New ships rolled out of construction yards every week, and each one carried weapons that had been upgraded with technology learned from captured enemy vessels. The humans had always been good at adapting and improving what others created, and now they applied that skill to instruments of war. Captain Laura Pierce stood on the bridge of the Vengeance as her task force approached the Carthan system deep in Vaxan territory. Intelligence reports said this was where the fleet that attacked New Plymouth had returned for resupply and repairs. The system contained a major naval base with defense platforms and a garrison fleet of 30 ships. Commander Ryan Foster had spent months tracking supply shipments and communication patterns to confirm this was the right target. Ryan brought up tactical displays showing the system's defenses. The base orbited a gas giant in the outer system, protected by 18 defense platforms equipped with heavy plasma cannons. The garrison fleet was spread across 3 different orbital positions, with the command ships stationed closest to the base itself. Laura studied the information and noted that her task force of 15 ships was outnumbered 2-1. Her executive officer pointed this out and suggested waiting for reinforcements that were scheduled to arrive in 2 weeks. Laura rejected the suggestion immediately. She told her officers that the enemy had not waited before attacking civilians, and humanity would not wait now. Every day they delayed was another day. The ships that bombed New Plymouth remained operational. She ordered the task force to battle stations and began issuing commands for the attack. Her plan was aggressive and risky, but it played to human strengths that the enemy had not yet learned to respect. The attack began with long-range missile strikes against the defense platforms. Human missiles were faster and more maneuverable than the vaccine designers expected. 6 platforms exploded in the first salvo before they could activate their shields. The garrison fleet responded immediately, but their reaction was defensive and cautious. They moved to protect the base, rather than pursuing the human ships in that. Gave Laura the opening she needed. She ordered half her task force to continue engaging the platforms while she led, the other half directly at the enemy fleet. The Vengeance accelerated to combat speed with 4 other ships following close behind. Vaccine cruisers opened fire, but Laura's ships weaved through the plasma blasts, using maneuvers that pushed the crews to their physical limits. Human pilots trained in high-gravity conditions and could handle acceleration that would kill most other species. The battle turned into close-range chaos as human ships closed the distance faster than the vaccine commanders anticipated. Laura brought the Vengeance, alongside a heavy cruiser and her weapons officer, targeted the enemy shield generators with precision fire. The shields collapsed, and the Vengeance raked the cruiser's hull with kinetic rounds that tore through armor plating. The cruiser tried to pull away, but a human destroyer came up on its other side, and the 2 ships caught it in crossfire. Across the battle space, human ships fought with a ferocity that shocked the vaccine fleet. When conventional tactics were not enough, human captains tried things that seemed insane to their enemies. One frigate captain, whose shields had failed and whose weapons were offline, turned his ship into a projectile. He aimed at a vaccine carrier and pushed his engines to maximum before the crew evacuated in escape pods. The frigate struck the carrier at a significant fraction of light speed in both ships, vanished in a ball of expanding plasma. The fighter pilots launched from the Vengeance demonstrated the same aggressive style. They flew in close formations that made targeting difficult and broke away at the last second to avoid enemy fire. When a pilot ship took critical damage, they did not retreat. Instead, they used their remaining fuel to ram enemy vessels or self-destructed near enemy formations to damage multiple ships. The vaccine pilots had never encountered enemies willing to sacrifice themselves so readily. Commander Ryan Foster monitored communications from the enemy fleet, and what he heard changed during the battle. The early transmissions were confident and tactical. As the battle continued, the tone shifted to confusion and then to fear. Enemy commanders reported that human ships kept fighting even when badly damaged. They said the humans did not retreat when the logical choice was to withdraw. One transmission said the humans fought like they had already accepted death and just wanted to take as many enemies with them as possible. The battle lasted 18 hours before the surviving vaccine ships began jumping out of the system. The base was destroyed and debris filled the orbital space around the gas giant. Of the 30 vaccine ships that started the battle, only 9 escaped. The human task force had lost 6 ships, and 5 more were badly damaged, but they had accomplished their mission. The fleet that attacked New Plymouth had been found and destroyed. Laura walked through the damaged corridors of the Vengeance. While repair crews worked to patch hull breaches and restore systems, she passed wounded crew members being carried to medical bay and saw the exhaustion on every face. The victory had cost them dearly, but nobody questioned whether it was worth it. Ryan found her staring at a section of wall where someone had painted 3 words in red letters. Remember New Plymouth? He told her that intelligence had intercepted a message from one of the escaping vaccine ships. The message was sent to their high command, and Ryan had the translation. Laura read it on his datapad, and a grim smile crossed her face. The vaccine captain reported that humans did not fight like any species they had encountered before. He said humans did not fight to win territory or gain advantage. They fought to kill, and they did not stop until everything was destroyed. The message ended with a request for immediate evacuation of all forward bases because the captain believed more human attacks were coming. Laura told Ryan to transmit that message to every ship in the human fleet. She wanted all their people to know that the enemy was starting to understand what they faced. She also wanted the enemy to know that this was just the beginning. The hunt had started, and it would not end until every ship and every base and every officer involved in the New Plymouth attack had been dealt with across the galaxy. Other human fleets were conducting similar operations. Captain Nick Carter led a squadron hunting the Zelthon cruisers that had provided orbital support during the massacre. His ships found the cruisers refueling at a supply station and destroyed both the cruisers and the station. Commander Helen Drake led marine assault teams that hit enemy supply depots on 3 different worlds. Every species that participated in the attack found themselves under siege from multiple directions. The Galactic Council called emergency sessions. As reports of human attacks reached the Unity Station, member species demanded to know how one race could coordinate so many operations across such vast distances. Military analysts studied the human tactics and realized something disturbing. The humans were not fighting a traditional war with clear objectives and endgames. They were conducting a campaign of systematic retribution that targeted specific ships and specific commanders. Ambassador Krell attended the council session, but his earlier confidence had vanished. His empire was losing ships faster than they could be replaced. His people were demanding to know why they had started a war with such a dangerous enemy. Other species voiced similar concerns. The Thalian Consortium reported that human raiders were destroying their merchant vessels. The Zelthan Republic said human forces had blockaded 2 of their colony worlds. Every species that voted for the attack was now paying the price. Elder Vorn sat in his seat watching the council argue and panic. When there was a pause in the shouting, he spoke in his quiet voice that somehow carried through the chamber. He reminded them that he had warned against this exact situation. He said that humans were now doing exactly what he predicted they would do. They were hunting down everyone responsible for the attack, and they would not stop until their sense of justice was satisfied. Krell demanded to know how they could negotiate with the humans. Elder Vorn shook his head slowly and said, "You could not negotiate with humans in the middle of a hunt any more than you could negotiate with a star-going supernova. This would end only when humanity decided it would end and not before." A representative from the Thalian Consortium asked what they should do. Vorn told them to endure and to hope that humans would show mercy when their anger finally cooled. He said the council had awakened, something that had not been seen in the galaxy for thousands of years. They had found a species with perfect memory and infinite patience for revenge. The humans would rebuild after every defeat and learn from every setback. They would track down everyone involved, no matter how long it took or how far they had to travel. The Council had wanted to put humanity in its place, but instead they had created an enemy that would never stop coming. Laura Pierce received new orders while her task force was still making repairs. Admiral Stone had identified another target and wanted her to move as soon as her ships were combat capable. She read the orders and saw that the next target was even deeper in enemy territory near a populated Vaxxan colony world. Her officers expressed concern about civilian casualties, but Laura's response was cold and direct. She said the enemy should have thought about civilian casualties before they bombed New Plymouth. The hunt continued, and nothing would stop it until every debt was paid in full. 2 years had passed since New Plymouth burned, and the war had evolved into something that historians would study for generations. What began as military strikes against specific targets had grown into a comprehensive campaign that Admiral Richard Stone called total strategic accountability. Every species that voted for the attack now lived under the shadow of human retribution. Their trade routes were disrupted, and their colonies lived in fear, and their military forces were spread thin, trying to defend against attacks that could come from any direction. Captain Ben Hayes had been promoted after surviving the fall of New Plymouth and now commanded a battle group of 20 ships hunting the remnants of the Vaxxan home fleet. His flagship was a heavy cruiser called Retribution, and every ship under his command had painted the same 3 words on their hulls in every major galactic language. "Remember New Plymouth." The words were a promise and a warning that followed Vaxxan ships. Wherever they fled, Lieutenant Danny Brooks served as Ben's censor officer and had developed an almost supernatural ability to track enemy fleet movements. He studied supply patterns and communication intercepts and predicted where enemy ships would be before they arrived. His latest intelligence report indicated that the Vaxan Emperor's personal flagship was in the Corvus system near the Vaxan homeworld with only a light escort. Ben studied the tactical data and noted that the system was deep in core Vaxan territory surrounded by civilian populations. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Sam Port, pointed out that engaging near civilian infrastructure would be complicated. The Vaxan leadership had deliberately positioned their remaining military assets near population centers, hoping that humans would hesitate to attack, Sam suggested. This might be a trap designed to make humans look like the aggressors if civilian casualties resulted from the fighting. Ben listened to the analysis and understood the political implications, but his decision was immediate and final. He told his officers that the enemy had not hesitated when they targeted civilian populations at New Plymouth. The Vaxan High Command had made their choice when they authorized the attack, and now they would face the consequences. Ben ordered the battle group to jump to the Corvus system, and all ships went to combat readiness. The crews had fought together for 2 years, and they moved with practiced efficiency. Every person on every ship knew what they were fighting for. The jump into the Corvus system brought the human battle group face to face with the Imperial flagship and its escorts. The Vaxan ships were positioned in orbit around a major colony world that held 2 billion civilians. The Imperial flagship was massive and ornate, with decorations that showed the wealth and power of the Vaxan Empire. Ben opened a general communication channel and offered the Vaxan commander one chance to surrender without fighting near the civilian population. The response came from Ambassador Councl himself, who had fled the Galactic Council to rally his people for continued resistance. His voice over the communication channel carried defiance mixed with desperation. He said the humans had proven themselves to be monsters who destroyed everything in their path. He called them a plague upon the galaxy that needed to be eliminated. He refused to surrender and ordered his ships to engage. The battle was brief but intense. Human ships had learned much about Vaxan tactics over 2 years of warfare. Ben's captains anticipated every move the enemy made and countered with precision. The Retribution led the assault on the flagship using weapons fire that targeted specific systems rather than simply overwhelming the enemy with firepower. They disabled the flagship's engines first and then methodically took out its weapons and shields while avoiding strikes that might send debris falling toward the planet below. The Imperial flagship tried to escape, but found itself surrounded by human vessels that had positioned themselves with careful planning. Ben ordered boarding teams to prepare, and Marine forces assembled in the launch bays. Commander Lisa Grant led the assault team that breached the flagship's hull and fought their way through corridors filled with Vaxan soldiers. The fighting inside the ship was brutal and close quarters, but the Marines had trained for exactly this scenario. Ben himself joined the final assault on the command center. He led a squad through damaged sections of the ship where fire still burned and bodies lay where they had fallen. They reached the command center and blew the doors open with explosive charges. Inside, they found Councl surrounded by his personal guard. The fight lasted 30 seconds before the guards were dead, and Councl stood alone facing the human soldiers. Ben lowered his weapon and looked at the Vaxan leader who had started this war. Councl's scales were scarred and his ornate robes were torn, but his eyes still showed defiance. Ben told him that this could have all been avoided. They could have listened to the warning. They could have left humanity alone. Councl spit on the deck and said his people thought humans were weak and would accept their place in the galactic order. Like every other young species, Ben's voice was quiet when he replied. He said humans had been farmers and engineers who wanted nothing more than to build colonies and raise families. They had dreams of peaceful exploration and cooperation with other species. The Vaxan Empire had turned them into something else. They had forced humanity to become hunters and warriors. That transformation was not humanity's fault, and the responsibility rested entirely on those who made the decision to attack. Meanwhile, on Earth, the cost of the war weighed heavily on those who governed. Secretary General Patricia Cole walked through the Memorial Garden, where holographic displays showed every person lost at New Plymouth. 3 million faces appeared and disappeared in a slow rotation. Each display showed not just a face but a name and a life story. Teachers and farmers and children and elderly, all gone because of one decision made in a council chamber light years away. Gregory Hunt served as Patricia's chief of staff and found her standing before the display of a young girl named Emma, who had been 6 years old when she died. He told Patricia that Admiral Stone was requesting authorization for the final phase of the campaign. The Admiral wanted to take the war directly to the Galactic Council itself. He wanted to lay siege to Unity Station and force every member species to answer for their vote. Patricia asked if humanity had the moral authority to do such a thing. They had been the victims, but 2 years of war had turned them into something else. How many alien civilians had died in the crossfire? How many innocent beings had suffered because of decisions their leaders made? Gregory's response was immediate. He asked if they had the moral authority not to do it. If humanity stopped now, what message would that send? That killing 3 million humans was acceptable as long as you eventually surrendered and apologized. The question hung in the air between them. Patricia looked at Emma's smiling face frozen in the hologram, a child who would never grow up and never have children of her own. She thought about all the other faces rotating through the display. She thought about the faces of alien civilians who had died in the war that followed. The weight of command felt crushing, but she had made her choice 2 years ago, and she would see it through to the end, she told Gregory to give Admiral Stone authorization for the final phase. They would go to Unity Station, and they would demand accountability from every species that voted for the attack. But she made it clear in her orders that this was not a war of conquest. Humanity was not seeking to rule the galaxy or dominate other species. They were seeking justice and recognition that actions had consequences. Every species that participated in the attack would answer for what they had done. Admiral Stone received the authorization and began assembling the largest human fleet ever gathered. Ships from every colony and every battle group received orders to converge on Unity Station. The fleet would include 200 warships and support vessels, along with diplomatic staff to handle the negotiations that would follow. This would not be a battle if the Council chose to surrender. But if they chose to fight, then humanity would finish what the Council had started. Sophie Blake received orders to join the fleet as the primary diplomatic officer. She had spent 2 years watching the war unfold and had never forgotten sitting in the Council chamber. When they voted to attack, now she would return to that same chamber, but this time humanity would not be sitting in the observer section. It would be dictating terms. She packed her belongings and prepared for the journey, knowing that everything would change when the human fleet arrived. Captain Laura Pierce brought the vengeance. Back from its latest mission and received new orders to join the Unity Station fleet. Her ship showed the scars of 2 years of combat. Sections of hull plating had been replaced multiple times, and the crew had rotated through more members than she could count. But the ship still flew, and the crew still fought, and they would be there when humanity made its final statement to the galaxy. Across human space, the word spread that the endgame was approaching. People gathered in public spaces to watch news broadcasts about the fleet assembly. Some celebrated, believing that victory was near. Others worried about what would come after. Everyone understood that the galaxy would never be the same regardless of how this ended. Humanity had proven itself to be exactly what Elder Vorn warned about. They were a species that never forgot and never stopped. Coming until justice was satisfied according to their own measure, the fleet began moving toward Unity Station, and the galaxy held its breath, waiting to see how this would end. The human fleet arrived at Unity Station like a storm that had been building for 2 years. 200 warships took positions surrounding the massive structure while civilian vessels were allowed to evacuate. The station's defense systems powered up, but did not fire because everyone inside understood that fighting would only delay the inevitable. The Galactic Council had started this war with confidence, but now they faced the reality of what they had awakened. Admiral Richard Stone commanded from his flagship and watched as the evacuation proceeded. Thousands of civilians left the station. On transport ships that human vessels escorted to safe jump points. The process took 3 days, and during that time the fleet maintained complete blockade. No supplies entered and no military vessels approached. The Council sat inside their chamber, knowing that their time of power was ending. Commander Helen Drake led the boarding force that entered Unity Station once the evacuation completed. She had fought on a dozen worlds during the war and had earned the respect of every Marine under her command. Behind her walked representatives from every human colony, carrying data files that contained information the Council would be forced to confront. The Marines moved through the station's corridors without resistance and reached the Council chamber where the leaders of 47 species wait. The Council members sat in their seats surrounded by human Marines who had taken positions at every entrance. Ambassador Krell was brought in, wearing restraints because he had been captured when his flagship fell. His imperial robes were gone, and he wore simple prison clothing. The other council members watched him enter, and several looked away, unable to meet his eyes. He had convinced them to vote for war, and now they all would pay the price together. Admiral Stone entered the chamber wearing his dress uniform with medals that represented 2 years of constant warfare. The chamber fell silent as he walked to the center where speakers traditionally stood to address the council. He carried a single data pad and placed it on the floor at his feet. The gesture was deliberate and symbolic. He was not asking for permission to speak. He was telling them how things would be. He said the data pad contained names. 3,472,618 names to be exact. Every human who died when the Council decided they were acceptable casualties in political calculations. Men and women and children who were killed without warning and without mercy. He said each name represented a life that had been stolen and a future that would never happen. The Council had taken those lives as casually as someone might discard trash. A representative from the Thelian Consortium named Elder Marsh spoke up with a voice that shook. He said the Council understood that humanity sought justice and they were prepared to discuss terms. He offered reparations and territorial concessions and access to resources. The Council would grant whatever reasonable demands humanity made to end this war. His words were carefully chosen to sound conciliatory, but also suggested that there were limits to what would be acceptable. Stone's laugh was cold and harsh. He said the Council still did not understand after 2 years of war. Humanity did not want territory or resources or wealth. Those things could not bring back the dead. Those things could not undo what had been done. He said the Council seemed to think this was a negotiation where both sides would compromise and reach an agreement. But this was not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. Elder Vorn had been allowed to remain in the chamber as a neutral observer because his species had voted against the attack. He spoke now in his quiet, ancient voice. He told the other council members that humans wanted them to remember. They wanted every species that voted for the attack to carry the weight of what they had done. The humans wanted to ensure that New Plymouth would never be forgotten, and that the cost of attacking humanity would be remembered across generations. Sophie Blake stepped forward, carrying a document that outlined humanity's terms. She had helped write these terms and had argued for days with military and civilian leaders about what justice should look like. The final document represented a consensus that surprised many who expected humanity to demand blood for blood. She read the terms aloud, so that every council member could hear clearly. Every species that voted for the attack on New Plymouth would pay reparations, but not in the traditional sense. They would build memorials to the human dead on their homeworlds. These memorials would be placed in locations where citizens would see them regularly and be reminded of what their government had done. The names of all 3 million victims would be carved in stone or metal, so they could not be erased or forgotten. The schools on every guilty world would teach about New Plymouth. Children would learn what happened and why. They would learn the names of their leaders who voted for the attack. They would learn about the war that followed and the cost that both sides paid. This education would be mandatory and would continue for at least 100 years. The date of the attack would become an annual day of remembrance in every civilization that participated most. Significantly, humanity demanded permanent representation. On the Galactic Council, with full voting rights and veto power over any military action, never again would the Council be able to vote for war without facing immediate consequences. If any species proposed military action against another, the victim species would have a voice in the decision. The Council's power to act unilaterally was ended. Ambassador Krell spoke from his position in restraints. He called the terms humiliation, designed to reduce proud civilizations to servants. He said humanity was taking revenge by destroying the dignity of species that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. His voice carried bitterness and rage. Several other council members nodded agreement. Though none spoke up to support him openly, Captain Laura Pierce stepped forward. She had commanded the Vengeance through dozens of battles and had lost crew members who became like family to her. She had also lost her brother at New Plymouth in the initial attack. She looked at Krell with eyes that showed no sympathy. She told him that he was alive and his people were alive. That was more than he had granted to the families eating dinner when his bombs fell. Living with what they had done was not humiliation. It was mercy. The Council had no choice but to accept the terms. The alternative was continued war against an enemy that had proven they would never stop. One by one, the representatives of guilty species stood and formally accepted humanity's demands. Some did so with dignity. Others wept. A few remained silent and simply nodded. The great powers of the galaxy bent to the will of a species they had, dismissed as insignificant. Just 2 years earlier, the war officially ended with signatures on documents that would be studied by historians for centuries. But the real work began afterward, when the memorials were constructed and the history lessons were written. On 47 worlds, monuments rose bearing the names of people who died at New Plymouth. Students learned about the consequences of their leaders' decisions. Politicians made speeches on Remembrance Days, acknowledging what their predecessors had done. 3 years after the attack on New Plymouth, a ceremony was held at the rebuilt colony. Commander Ben Hayes attended wearing his dress uniform. Sophie Blake stood beside him, having been promoted to captain. They watched as the primary memorial was dedicated. The structure was made of black stone and rose 30 meters high, with every name carved into its surface. Families of the dead attended, and many placed flowers at the base. Children played in parks near the memorial, growing up in a colony that had been nothing but ash and ruins. New buildings stood where cities had burned. Farms covered land that had been scorched by plasma fire. Life had returned to New Plymouth, but it was not the same place. The innocence was gone, and everyone who lived there knew they existed on ground where millions had died. Ben watched the children and wondered if humanity had done the right thing. They had demanded justice and received it. They had made the galaxy remember. But the cost had been enormous. Human casualties over 2 years of war numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Alien casualties were higher. Ships and stations and infrastructure destroyed. Trust between species damaged perhaps beyond repair. He asked Sophie if she thought they had made the right choice. Sophie was quiet for a long time before answering. She said there were no right choices after New Plymouth. There were only necessary ones. Humanity had shown the galaxy that actions had consequences. They had proven that you could not murder millions of humans and simply move forward as if nothing happened. The galaxy was safer now, because every species understood the cost of attacking humanity. Whether that made it right, she could not say. Elder Vorn made a final entry in the Keeper archives after the war ended. His species had observed countless civilizations rise and fall across 10,000 years. He wrote that humanity had taught the galaxy an ancient truth that many had forgotten. Vengeance was not about anger. It was about memory. Humans never forgot those who wronged them and would pursue justice to the edge of eternity, if necessary. He wrote that humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest, or the wisest, or the most technologically advanced, but they possessed something that made them the most dangerous. They had the ability to remember every injury and the will to ensure that debts were paid. Other species might forgive, or forget, or move on. Humans would do none of these things until they decided. Justice was satisfied. The galaxy had learned this lesson at terrible cost. The war had reshaped political structures and changed how species interacted with each other. The Galactic Council still existed, but it operated under new rules where power was checked and military action required consensus. Humanity sat at the table as equals with veto power that ensured their voice would always be heard. Years passed, and the memorials on 47 worlds remained. Students continued learning about New Plymouth in their classes. The date of the attack was marked annually with ceremonies that grew smaller over time but never disappeared completely. The galaxy slowly healed, but the scars remained visible. Trade resumed and diplomatic relations normalized, but everyone remembered what had happened. Captain Laura Pierce retired from military service and became a teacher. She taught history at the university on New Plymouth, and her students came from dozens of species, including some whose governments had attacked the colony. She told them about the war and the cost and the lessons learned. She told them that humanity had not wanted to be warriors. They had wanted to be explorers and farmers and artists. War had been forced upon them. The final lesson, she taught W.